Those with universal application will be discussed on future programs. Matters of a more personal nature will be answered by mail. Challenge is produced by KOMO's Department of Public Affairs in the hope that the combined experience of these three men will be of help to many of us. Challenge was directed by Ed Lackner. Join us next week at the same time when Rabbi Levine, Dr. Goslin, and Father Tracy will again explore the challenges Americans face today. Many doctors say every time they visit their vegetable garden of very old people being kept alive by drugs far beyond their time, they become extremely concerned again with the whole problem. Medicine receives great criticism for the financial burden this imposes on families of patients such as these. Yet theirs is still the moral burden to maintain life as long as it is within their power. Has modern medical science outstepped its usefulness in this instance? How does the clergy feel about continuing life by the use of drugs, long past the point of awareness or even caring? Good evening. The program is Challenge. The subject, Let Them Die with Dignity. Now let's meet the members of the Challenge panel. A rabbi, a minister, and a priest. Together they offer their counsel on many of the challenges we face in today's world. First, Dr. Lynn Corson, Senior Minister at the University Methodist Temple. Next, Father William Tracy, Director of the Catholic Information Center. And the moderator for this evening, Rabbi Raphael Levine, Senior Rabbi at the Temple de Hirsch.
Thank you, Don, and good evening. Marty Camp, our producer of this program, tells us that a doctor friend of hers asked her, saying, Marty, how about your challenge panel doing something of real value in a desperately confused area? The area of very old people being kept alive by drugs far beyond their time. And we don't get any help from the clergy, either with the family or with the patients on this problem. How does the clergy feel about continuing life by drugs long after the point of awareness or caring? It is one thing to save people's lives, to help them over to health. It is another thing to keep a person breathing for 2 years or even 2 months, and when the end is inevitable and sure. Now tonight, our challenge panel is going to take up the challenge of Marty Camp's doctor friend. And we're going to discuss this problem under the title that was announced, Let Them Die with Dignity. Now, Father Tracy, they asked us about what is the clergy's attitude toward this problem. All right, what is the Catholic attitude to this idea of allowing people to live artificially long beyond the time when there is no possibility of their recovery?
Well, in a Catholic position, Rabbi Levine, life, of course, is a gift from God. And the individual has stewardship over it. Therefore, he's not at liberty to terminate his life by suicide or by euthanasia, mercy killing, either himself or asking someone else to do it. Both these points are out. However, we make a distinction between taking ordinary care of your life, which if you neglect, like taking food or getting a blood transfusion or something, and extraordinary care. Now, it's difficult to assess in an individual case what is extraordinary care, and perhaps in the course of the discussion we can come to that. But in the opening point that I would like to make is this, that death in the Catholic Church is receiving new study, believe it or not, because we are, to some extent, tainted by the culture of any period in which the Church is in existence. We have been given a particular concept and insight into death in the Christian religion as being the beginning of a new life for the Christian. But we can get sidetracked on that somewhat in the same way as different ages, Rabbi, say the Puritans and the Victorians got sidetracked about the beginning of life. And now they're going to the other extreme as if the only problem about human existence was how to describe the beginning of human life, to talk about the facts of life, and they're all concerned about its beginning. But we believe that the facts of life adequately presented include a philosophy of death, and that it must be faced as calmly as you would explain to a child or an adult the coming of new life into the world. And that is why I was so impressed a couple of years ago when a grandmother was visiting with me, or at least I was calling to see her up at Providence Hospital. And her children were married, and she had several grandchildren. And this illness was what they would call a terminal case. And she said to me, "Father, I have got one work in life to do, to show my children how to die with dignity and faith." Now, this woman was not afraid of death, and she didn't want this extra burden of expense of being prolonged by extraordinary means at all. There was a job to be done, and she wanted to do it and do it well. Now, that's the kind of philosophy that's truly Catholic in my book.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Corson, what would be, I know you can't speak for all Protestants, but what would you say is generally the Protestant attitude toward this problem?
Well, in the first place, before I discuss the Protestant attitude, let me say that the concern which is evidenced by the doctors here is a concern that you can honor because it really has as a presupposition a sense of the value of life. And the very fact that they would raise questions like this, ethical and moral questions, indicate that there is a real comprehension of the value of our humanity. Only people who value human life, in a sense, in its religious framework, as being, man as being a child of God with human dignity, and in the sense in which you reverence human life, raises the problems similar to the problems we're discussing this evening. Now, as far as Protestantism is concerned, I suppose, again, you have a wide range of views in reference to this, but generally speaking, I think I could speak for most of my Protestant colleagues by indicating that, that in these terminal cases, just the mere prolongation of life by artificial means is not serving the purpose for the well-being of the individual or serving God's intention for that life. We are born into this world, and we live our span of years, and by the natural processes, God takes us from this world unto himself. And the artificial means, which are legitimately used by the medical profession because they are committed to the point of keeping people alive, and I can honor this, the artificial means of keeping a person alive beyond his normal span of years, seems to me to be in contradiction, really, with our sense of the dignity of human life and the basic values which are inherent in our humanity. So, fundamentally, Protestantism would agree, I think, with the position that this unnecessary and needless prolongation is against the intentions of God for the individual.
You know, Dr. Corson, you use the expression beyond the normal span of years. I'm sure what you meant was, and the reason I'm commenting on this is that I don't want you at home to misunderstand. You meant beyond the span when life is impossible.
Oh, this is so, yes.
That is in a terminal illness where there's no possibility of recovery, and it's merely maintaining breathing, a person breathing like a vegetable with no possibility. That's what you mean.
This,
I know.
of course.
I know that, but I wanted to clarify it because it could be misunderstood.
Of course, the normal span of years is increasing all the while,
Of course,
you know. The
of
medical
course.
sciences have promised us that we may live to be 120 to 125 years old. But this is also on the presupposition that we have our faculties.
Yes, there's hope for recovery.
And hope for recovery, yes.
Of course. Now, I'm glad you pointed up the doctor's position and the doctor's dilemma. It is a very serious one because the doctors are committed to the famous Hippocratic Oath, and that is to do everything that is humanly possible to maintain and to preserve life. But I think sometimes that there is a misinterpretation of even of this Hippocratic Oath in this particular connection. I would say as a Jew, and I think I'm speaking for the Jewish tradition, that to preserve life is essential as far as is humanly possible, but we are not expected to preserve life by extraordinary means where there is no possibility of recovery of health in the terminal illness such as we are talking about. In other words, to use extraordinary means, and I'll give you an example of what I mean. There was a 90-year-old man I read about who was dying of cancer. And while he was in his hospital, he maybe had another month to live or 2 months to live, he contracted pneumonia. Now, the doctor used extraordinary means to cure the pneumonia, only to allow this man to linger another month before he died in agony and pain. Sure, they kept him free from some of the pain through sedatives, but he was practically unconscious all the time through these sedatives. This is what we mean, using extraordinary means.
Yes, of course, you have to honor the doctor. He had a professional duty to perform.
I do, but I'm not so sure that he interpreted his duty for the best interests, both of the individual and for society, and even the medical profession.
Let me say that when I knew that we were going to be discussing this program on challenge, I took the opportunity to confront a small group of young women who were meeting at on a particular occasion with the question, what would you do? And what would your reaction be if you were confronted by a decision in terms of a loved one, keeping that loved one alive artificially beyond all hope of recovery, just to keep breath in the body? Two of those young women answered the question. One was the wife of a doctor, and she said, this is precisely the problem my husband faces in his practice. He himself does not know how legitimate it is, fundamentally legitimate, and how honest it is to try to keep a person alive artificially when all other resources have failed, just to keep breath in the body. And the other woman, young woman who answered, said, we are facing this right now in our family. She said, we have an old aunt who is dying of cancer. She must be ministered to almost around the clock by special nurses. There is no hope, at least we cannot see any hope of a recovery. She doesn't know us except on rare moments. She is rarely conscious, and yet the family feels that they cannot, in any sense of the word, release her from life by withdrawing treatment. And the doctors feel a compulsion to keep on because of their commitment to their oath. And the whole family and the doctors who minister to her are in a dilemma as to just exactly what to do. And she herself, in her rare moments of lucidity, says, oh, I wish I could die. I wish I could go home to be with God. Why do I have to stay on and suffer? Well, here is a real problem growing out of real life, which poses the dilemma.
Mm-hmm. I think, Rabbi, one of the most beautiful, simple philosophies of death that I've ever come across was one time I was visiting an old Irishman. He was about 80 in the hospital, and he had cancer. I forget where it had struck him. So there was no question of going in and talking to him about the weather and politics and fishing and so forth. We talked about the fact that he was going to die, you see, and well, it's too bad. I said that you're going to be hospitalized here for some time. He looked at me and he said, Father, death has to have some excuse, doesn't it? I mean, there's some way. We have to go by various ways. So this is the philosophy of death. Now, I can sympathize with the doctor who feels that he has got to keep life there till the last minute. Good has come out of that. But I would also like to share a thought with the doctor who is in the dilemma that Dr. Corson mentioned about keeping somebody alive who is perhaps half conscious. That person has got a right, from the Catholic viewpoint, and I think you will agree, the right, if they have made their peace with God, as they indicated, to die with dignity. Let me quote to you a statement by one of our very prominent Catholic physicians and psychiatrists, Dr. Kavanaugh of Chicago. He said, concerning the right to die with dignity, should we not remove these instruments, for example, tubes, needles, which have ceased to have value, and make up the bed and allow the family to share the terminal hours of consciousness if they remain? And then he answers his own question. He said, I would urge that we all promote the idea of a dignified, pleasant death in the dying patient. There is no need to prolong the dying process, nor is there any moral or medical justification for doing so. Euthanasia, the speeding up of it by drugs or something like that, he said, that's different, that's never justified. But allowing the patient to die peaceably and in dignity is always justified.
This is beyond an academic question with me, because we face this in our own family. My father, at the age of 53, contracted cancer, and rapidly it wove its way into the very structure of his body to the point where he was facing a very critical operation, which the doctor said had no likelihood whatever of being successful. And if it were even partially successful, would have left him just as an animal, losing completely all of his mental faculties. The doctor said, what shall I do? And put up to the family. Well, when you are confronted by a situation like that, you weigh alternatives. You say, what would my father want? To live like a vegetable through these remaining years that God has given him? Or to be able to die in dignity and in peace? And we took the only course that we felt he would want under these circumstances. It wasn't euthanasia. It was just allowing the natural processes to work. That's right. And I have never for a moment regretted this. It would have been wonderful to have him through these latter years, but not on these terms.
Well, I think, Dr. Corson, you have done a very fine job of sharing that difficult decision with us. It comes from your heart, and it indicates what is so important for the relatives, because a study was made in Chicago, in St. Paul here 3 years ago, about telling people even about the cancer, whether they had it or not. So they interviewed some 87% of people who were supposedly cured to know if they should have been told. They interviewed, say, a group, and 87% said they preferred to be told. They also interviewed 92 current patients with far advanced cancer. Among the 75 who had been told they had cancer, the proportion who favored telling the truth was the same as amongst the cured. But, as one minister said in Chicago in studying these statistics, the minister has his tongue tied by well-meaning relatives who insist that he never mention anything about death to the patient. The minister is held back from helping his parishioner in a moment of crisis. So the minister is forced to limit his conversation to the weather and the activities of the Ladies' Aid. And not only that, but the wishes of the patient themselves, his welfare is neglected, because to come out and help him face the facts of life, you can help him make the decision to accept a death with dignity.
Father Tracy, you brought up another aspect of this general problem, and that is whether to prepare the patient for the inevitable consequences of death. This is a subject that really requires a program by itself. But since you've raised it, I would like to make a comment on it, and maybe we can spend a minute or two to talk about it, because it's right in line with
That's right.
Although the statistics you quoted are very impressive, that 87% said that they would like to have been told, I think that it is a very uncertain problem. It depends. It depends on the individual, whether he should be told or not. Now, in certain situations, that a person has to be told. For example, if a person has to put his affairs in order, he should be told. But if a person is not in that kind of a situation, and there is danger that if he were told that it would be equivalent to a sentence of death, that it would completely demoralize him, disintegrate his personality completely, and prevent him from using the wonderful therapeutic value of hope. I think that one should be very careful whether he should be told or not. I don't think there's any general rule. I think every situation has to be judged on its own merits.
The doctors who raised the question with Marty Camp were looking for some help. And I'm modestly suggesting now one or two things that might be considered by a doctor facing this kind of a decision. The first thing is, I think that probably he ought to have the frankest kind of discussion with the family. Let them know just exactly what the situation is, and apprise them of all the facts of the case, and ask the family to cooperate with him in making a judgment. Not an independent judgment of his own, but the family, plus the doctor. And then if there's doubt in the situation, a consultation is in order. Several doctors who together, collectively, reviewing the material before them, and understanding the nature of the illness, and coming to conclusions collectively, supporting each other in their opinion. It would seem to me that families understanding the problem completely, and doctors in consultation, then it doesn't become the judgment of one individual. It becomes the judgment of a group of individuals primarily concerned about the welfare of the person. And if the conclusion is that under the circumstances, this person should be allowed to die in dignity, then it would seem to me this is a right conclusion to make, with all the factors involved and all the consultations supporting each other, so that no individual is responsible.
May I bring up another subject in this connection that we haven't touched because it's a very delicate subject, and that is finances. You know, whenever you talk about money, when life is involved, one feels a sense of guilt. And people who are confronted with the problem of a terminal illness, a very expensive illness, with nurses around the clock, where the situation is such that a family can be ruined financially, and a whole generation can be ruined in this connection, where, for instance, the opportunity for educating children is taken away from them because the money is spent in this way and all that sort of thing. Nevertheless, it's a delicate thing to talk about money when life is involved. Nevertheless, I think that we ought to face it, that here, too, is a problem, that when a person is faced by this kind of a terminal illness, and the family is placed in a position where they're actually mortgaging their future for no purpose, because that person cannot recover, impossible, merely prolonging his illness and maybe his suffering, I would say, and I would say it without any qualms of conscience, that that family need not feel any guilt feelings if, in consultation with the doctors, as you have said, they decide not to use extraordinary means, not to put the person to death, no, not euthanasia, not to put him to sleep, but not to use extraordinary means just to keep them breathing.
I agree 100%, Rabbi Levine, and when I made my opening statement that life comes from God, the individual cannot take it himself or ask anyone else to take it, and that mercy killing is out, that he is at the same time not bound to take extraordinary means, and extraordinary means would indicate expensive drugs, expensive nursing care, expensive operations, because they do cost expense. So he need not put this on his family, but this presupposes a philosophy of death, something that should be faced before he comes to that terminal case. And facing off it is part of the facts of life, both by the doctor, the family, and the relatives. And that's why I would like, at my concluding remark on this program, to read a brief letter written by a mother, 42 years old, who has entered a hospital in San Francisco last December 23rd to have a tumor removed from her brain. And she wrote this letter to her family, and I think it summarizes a philosophy of life that I think is ideal. She says, "My dear family, please don't grieve if the good Lord takes me, for he knows what is best for all of us. I firmly believe we are put upon this earth to accomplish a certain duty. Mine is finished. I have raised 2 wonderful children. God has blessed me in so many ways, a wonderful mother, father, and sister. I take some of the credit for choosing my husband, whom I love with all my heart. So I do thank God for all his blessings. I do believe in heaven, and I really and truly have no fear of leaving this earth. My greatest fear is living not well in mind, but that too I accept. And so you can understand why you are not to grieve for me. Remember, God works in wondrous ways, and I put my faith in his goodness. So, Mother darling, don't let this letter upset you, for it would hurt me so very much if I thought I was responsible for shortening your life by even 1 day. Again, I shall say, God is so kind and good, and I have no fear, so you mustn't." Now, it turned out a happy ending, because the last moment another x-ray indicated the surgery wasn't necessary, although this was her frame of mind. So it is in telling the patient, in facing this, she was, even from a medical viewpoint, better off by knowing the facts and having a good philosophy of death.
Yes, it's a beautiful letter. I'm afraid, we have 2 minutes. You want to say something?
Just that I'm very happy that you brought up this matter of finances, and that you encourage the elimination of a guilt feeling on the part of families in situations like this. They should have no sense of guilt in solving the problem as we have suggested.
Well, I think we have about a minute or so left, and I would like to sum up in that minute what is the burden of this program. And I'd like to, and I was glad that Dr. Corson gave some suggestions about cooperation with the family and the doctor, consultation of doctors and so forth. But I would like the doctors to know, here you've heard, and I hope you have heard this program, in which the clergy was challenged as to what is their attitude, what is their help, what is their guidance, what is their advice. Well, here you have the representatives of 3 faiths. You have Protestants, you have Catholics, you have Jews. We all agree that morally, ethically, in everything that we regard as value in our religious traditions, you do not have to use extraordinary means to keep a person breathing. Unless there is a hope for recovery, even if it's a remote hope, but if there's a hope for recovery and health of the person, do everything in your power to save that life. But if there is no hope, then you do not have to use extraordinary means to keep